I remember those vast, brooding buildings rising against lonely hills, like medieval fortresses left to rot. Structures conceived not merely to house the disturbed, but to dominate the landscape and those within it, as if the weight of stone and spire could somehow contain the wildness of the human mind. I learned later that the design had a name, the Kirkbride Plan, the brainchild of Dr. Thomas Story. Kirkbride, who in the late 1800s declared with the certainty of a prophet that the architecture itself must be part of the cure, a physical remedy for mental affliction, as tangible as any pill or potion. I would walk those bat-wing corridors and feel it, the intention embedded in every arch and cornice, every gargoyle perched high above the entryways, as though they too had been enlisted to guard the gates of sanity. In his 1854 treatise on the construction of hospitals for the insane, Kirkbride asserted with gravity that the building was a curative instrument, and this belief spread like gospel across a nation eager to civilize the chaos of the mind. Over 70 such institutions were built across America, each more elaborate than the last, their cost averaging $2.5 million at the time, a staggering sum that today would amount to roughly $60 million. These were not humble places of healing. No, these were cathedrals of control, each one rising like a monument to order imposed upon suffering. One of the most famous, and to me most haunting, was the Buffalo State Hospital in New York, a place I would come to know intimately. Designed in 1871 by Henry Hobson Richardson, a man whose name was spoken in architectural circles with reverence, the Buffalo Asylum loomed across the horizon, with its Medina sandstone walls and its twin copper-capped towers that soared 185 feet into the sky, catching the sun in ways that could almost be beautiful if you didn't know what lay inside. We called it the castle not just for its turrets and buttresses, but for its sense of being impenetrable both to those who wanted to escape and to those who wanted to understand. I used to run my fingers across the stone cold, even in summer, and imagine the thousands of hands that had done the same, grasping at something solid when the world around them dissolved. Dr. James Dean, who served as superintendent from 1900 to 1912, believed deeply in the power of architecture. I remember one of his reports where he wrote, "The very architecture speaks to the soul of the afflicted, reminding them of their separation from the world of the sane." It stuck with me, that phrase, separation from the world of the sane, as though madness were a continent, and we were all its castaways. The building had taken 3 years to erect, requiring over 8 million bricks and 200 stonemasons laboring day and night, their chisels carving permanence into suffering. A local rumor always circulated among the nurses and attendants that Richardson himself had lost his mind and was later confined at McLean. But it was untrue. He died of Bright's disease in 1886, though there was something tragic about his death all the same, as if the vision had consumed the visionary. By 1935, Buffalo housed over 800 patients in a space designed for just 600. I often wondered how Kirkbride would have felt seeing his model stretched so far beyond its original proportions, the bat-wing wings sagging under the weight of too many bodies and too few staff. And Buffalo was not alone in its excess. The Worcester State Hospital in Massachusetts, where I briefly trained, had burned down in the late 1800s and was rebuilt in 1901 with every good intention. Its corridors stretched almost a mile, and its wards were laid out in strict lines meant to facilitate classification and segregation of patients, what Dr. Hosea Quimby had once called the proper arrangement to prevent the mingling of different grades of insanity. But the truth I saw each morning when I entered the ward was not one of clinical efficiency or therapeutic peace. Former nurse Elizabeth Clark, whose diary I once read in the staff archive, captured it perfectly in 1918. The halls echo with screams at night, and the stench of unwashed bodies and soiled bedding pervades every corner. That smell never left you. We were housing 1-800 patients in spaces designed for 1-200, and the overflow spilled into corners and broom closets, into converted attics and makeshift basements. The violent ward was a name we whispered more than spoke aloud, tucked in the furthest wing, like a shameful secret, each cell just 6 feet by 8, with a single barred window too high for anyone to see through. I had seen the logbooks some patients confined there for over a decade, without ever once stepping outdoors, their minds unraveling in slow, silent protests that no one could hear or no one dared to understand. Danvers State Hospital was much the same, maybe worse, perched on Hathorne Hill in Massachusetts, with its Gothic architecture looming like something from a fever dream. Built in 1878, Danvers was designed to impress and to intimidate its central tower, rising like a sentinel above the town. By the 1920s, it held more people than anyone had imagined possible when its doors first opened. Dorothea Dix, the great reformer whose words had stirred legislators and philanthropists alike, visited in 1923 and wrote of her horror. 40 patients crowd into dormitories designed for 20, sleeping on thin mattresses laid directly on the floor. The walls weep with condensation, and rats scurry openly through the wards at night. And I saw it too. The rats didn't even run from us anymore. They were part of the hospital, as permanent as the bricks and the pipes. Danvers had tunnels beneath it, 2 miles of underground passageways that connected every building, and while they were meant for utilities, we used them also to transport the dead. Quietly, discreetly, as if death were an embarrassment best hidden below ground. Our architect, Nathaniel Bradley, had tried to imbue the building with meaning: 13 towers for the original American colonies, 1 to represent Christ, 12 for the apostles. But no number of towers could lift the gloom that settled on that hill. By 1939, we had 360 patients, and 1 doctor for every 250 of them. We worked with what we had. We did what we could. But sometimes late at night, I would walk those echoing corridors past doors that never opened and windows too high to touch, and I would wonder if all our stone and science had done anything at all but build prettier prisons. This was the architecture of our age, beautiful, terrible, unforgettable, and I lived within it, a small figure beneath high arches and heavy shadows, doing my best to care for the minds that history forgot. I remember how every hour was spoken, for how the day itself marched to a rhythm not of healing, but of control, a ritual of repetition that dulled the senses and wore down resistance like water against stone. And nowhere was this truer than in places like Pilgrim State Hospital in New York, a colossus among institutions which by 1954 held over 14,000 patients, making it the largest psychiatric hospital in the world, though few outside its red brick walls knew or cared to ask what life inside that behemoth truly felt like. For it was not a place of rest, but a place of endless routines, where even the sunlight seemed to arrive on a schedule. I still have a copy of the old daily schedule from 1925, yellowed now and stained with time, but its details remain vivid. Réveillé at 5:30 in the morning, cold baths at 6 sharp. Breakfast served with military precision at 6:30, and only 15 minutes allowed before the trays were cleared and cleaning duties began. Every patient was expected to scrub, sweep, or wipe under supervision, for cleanliness was not just a virtue but a duty, and idle hands were feared almost as much as unquiet minds. Yard time at 8 a.m., weather permitting, and the day rolled forward. In this way, a carousel of regulated tasks and supervised movement, the hours carved into increments too small to hold anything as unruly as freedom or thought. Dr. William J. Tiffany, our superintendent from 1931 to 1943, believed in the virtue of order and kept meticulous records that showed with cold efficiency how every month our patients performed over 100,000 hours of unpaid labor. Their collective efforts valued at roughly $25,000 in 1935 dollars, an enormous sum at the time, and one that helped keep the institution running without ever acknowledging the ethical abyss beneath such calculations. It was not uncommon to see patients sweeping courtyards, polishing windows, carrying laundry, or toiling in the kitchen, work done not for therapy, but for necessity, and yet still wrapped in the rhetoric of moral treatment, as though compulsion wore the mask of kindness. Our kitchen, I recall, was a thing of mechanical wonder and bureaucratic pride, preparing over 42,000 meals daily, an industrial operation so vast that it included a coffee urn capable of brewing 600 gallons at once. A sight so absurdly grand, it almost distracted from the fact that many of those meals were consumed in silence, under the watchful eyes of attendants, trained more in discipline than in empathy. The architecture itself, like everything else, was enlisted in the cause of surveillance and control. Long corridors stretched without curve or comfort, their straight lines designed not for aesthetic grace but for unobstructed visibility, so that no patient could hide and no moment could go unobserved. At the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, I came to understand the full extent of this architectural philosophy. Built with hand-cut limestone blocks, each weighing hundreds of pounds, and quarried by prison labor from nearby Moundsville Penitentiary, the structure was a monument to permanence and to punishment. Richard Andrews, the building's designer, claimed it was therapeutic architecture: high ceilings to improve air circulation, large windows to flood the rooms with light, and separate wings to accommodate the various categories of madness. Yet I remember how even the brightest rooms seemed to hold shadows that no sunlight could erase, and how the categories themselves became cages. Construction began in 1858, paused for the Civil War, during which the Army used it as a military post, and resumed with a grim determination to finish what had been started. For once the foundation had been laid, no one dared question whether the dream itself had soured. By 1938, Trans-Allegheny held 400 patients in space designed for 250, and I walked those overfilled halls, hearing voices not just from the patients, but from the walls themselves, a chorus of whispers and weeping that no insulation could contain. Every patient was classified into 23 categories, no less ranging from acute melancholia to religious paranoia, with specific wings or rooms tailored to their affliction, though what this meant in practice was often little more than separation by symptom rather than care by need. I remember the files thick with scribbled notes and outdated diagnoses, each folder a life reduced to a list of observations and prescriptions, sometimes with photographs clipped to the inside covers, faces frozen in moments of distress, misunderstood forever. I had hoped when I was transferred to Camarillo State Mental Hospital in California that the newer design might offer something different. Opened in 1936, Camarillo broke from the gloomy Gothic tradition with its Spanish colonial revival style, featuring airy courtyards, sun-drenched arcades, and red-tiled roofs that evoked the image of a peaceful mission more than a madhouse. And I will admit, for a moment, I believed the illusion, believed that exposure to fresh air and sunshine might soften the edges of despair. Superintendent Dr. Thomas Harris had said as much, declaring that the architecture itself would offer therapeutic benefit through exposure to fresh air and sunshine. But inside, the truth was less generous. Attendant James Miller, whose 1943 account I later read with a slow-burning recognition, wrote of patients left to sit in their own filth, some chained to benches in those very courtyards that had seemed so serene, and I remembered the smell and the stillness and the way some patients' eyes refused to meet yours, not out of shame, but because they had learned that connection led nowhere. Camarillo may have been beautiful on the outside, but beauty was not medicine, and walls, even whitewashed ones, still divide. By 1957, Camarillo held over 7,000 patients cared for by a staff of 1-800, and the hospital even maintained its own police force and fire department, a self-contained city of the mad, complete with its own rules and realities. And always, always, there was the distinction between paying and non-paying patients, those who could afford comfort and those who could not. I saw it most starkly at McLean Hospital in Massachusetts, where wealthy patients had private rooms, personal servants, and access to therapies and entertainments denied to those in the public wards, where beds were crammed into dormitories and privacy was a forgotten luxury. Poet Robert Lowell, who stayed there in 1958, once described the place in his poem Waking in the Blue, and I felt the truth of his words, down to the marrow, the tension between privilege and pain, between beauty and confinement. Dr. Edward Cowles, who ran the hospital from 1879 to 1904, once justified this disparity by claiming that different social classes required different accommodations to preserve their accustomed way of living, which he argued was essential for recovery. In 1912, private patients paid up to $100 per week, a princely sum, while state-funded ones cost the institution just $3.50, and received treatment to match. And so the architecture endured grand and grave like a cathedral, without prayer shaping the days of those who lived and worked within, reminding us all that while the buildings may have been erected in the name of healing, they were just as often monuments to containment, built not for hope, but for order. I remember how the treatments began not with compassion, but with curiosity, clinical cold, and often cruel, how the white coats and polished instruments carried an air of certainty that disguised the deep uncertainty behind every diagnosis, how the line between help and harm was blurred, if not altogether erased, by the desperation to cure minds that refused to conform. I lived through the era when experimentation was considered innovation, when we spoke of madness as something to be conquered rather than understood, and the tools we used, needles, electricity, steel, picks, were wielded as though they held the power to sculpt sanity out of suffering. We spoke often of moral treatment, and it sounded noble in theory, the idea that structure and kindness could guide a person back to health. But in practice, it became something far more rigid, a doctrine of discipline masquerading as therapy. At Worcester State Hospital, where I first learned the routines of institutional care, we subjected patients to strict schedules that left little room for rest or rebellion. Manual labor prayer services, mandatory social interactions, all enforced with the belief that routine would lead to regulation of the mind. Dr. Samuel Woodward, whose influence loomed large over the institution, wrote in his 1912 diary that the patient must learn to govern himself, to submit to authority, and to engage in useful occupation. And we believed it, or at least we obeyed it. At Willard State Hospital in New York, where I spent several hard years, this belief was pushed to its limits. The hospital operated like a small agricultural empire, its fields plowed by hands that trembled from medication or malnutrition, its barns filled with cows tended by patients who had once been professors, poets, or pianists. We worked them for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and the administration called it therapy. The annual report from 1923 still echoes in my memory. Patient labor had saved the institution $175,000 that year, equivalent to nearly $3 million in today's terms, and we were proud of that figure, even as we ignored the toll it took. Then came the shock therapies, and with them a new chapter in our story, one written not in ink, but in voltage and insulin in bodies convulsing, and minds erased. I remember when insulin shock therapy arrived like the promise of a miracle. In 1927, an Austrian psychiatrist named Manfred Sackel had discovered quite by accident that injecting patients with insulin to induce comas could sometimes bring about what we called a breakthrough, a return to lucidity, however brief. The method spread like wildfire, And by the time I found myself back at Pilgrim State Hospital in New York, the practice was in full force. Between 1936 and 1945, we administered the treatment to over 2,000 patients. I still hear the clatter of gurneys rolling down tiled halls, the hiss of syringes, the gasps as bodies spasmed violently into comas. Dr. Joseph Wirtis claimed an 88% cure rate in schizophrenic patients, and we clung to that number like a lifeline, even after follow-up studies revealed high relapse rates and an alarming number of deaths. Dr. Harold Bourne, one of the few voices to challenge the treatment, wrote in 1938, "We are not treating diseases, we are treating human beings whose problems cannot be solved by putting them into comas." And I wish more of us had listened. At Creedmoor State Hospital in 1940, alone 450 patients received insulin shock therapy and 17 never woke up. But even that method seemed gentle compared to what came next. Electroconvulsive therapy (ECT) arrived in the United States by 1940, a gift from two Italian psychiatrists, Ugo Cerletti and Lucio Bini, who had first tested it on pigs in Rome's slaughterhouse, observing how electric shocks rendered the animals unconscious without killing them. The first human patient was a 39-year-old man found babbling nonsense in the streets of Rome. After his treatment, he reportedly whispered, "Not another one, it's deadly." But we did not stop. The convulsions that followed the shock often fractured bones, dislocated jaws, and sometimes stopped hearts. Yet we pressed on, convinced the violence we inflicted was a necessary storm to calm the brain's turbulence. At Metropolitan State Hospital in Massachusetts, I remember watching rows of patients lined up like factory stock, waiting their turn beneath flickering hallway lights, their eyes vacant, their mouths dry with fear. In 1944 alone, 443 patients received ECT at that facility. Dr. Abraham Meyerson, a respected psychiatrist of the time, defended the practice by saying, "These people have more intelligence than they can handle, and the reduction of intelligence is an important factor in the curative process." I cannot hear those words now without a chill settling on my spine. And of course, there was Dr. Walter Freeman, the man who would become known as the father of the American lobotomy. I saw him just once, when he arrived in his converted Chevrolet, the infamous lobotomobile, rolling into a hospital parking lot with the confidence of a showman and the tools of a butcher. He believed that overactive emotions caused mental illness, and that severing the connections in the prefrontal cortex could silence the chaos. He performed over 3,500 lobotomies, many with an ice pick-like instrument inserted through the eye socket. And I recall reading about Rosemary Kennedy's sister to a future president reduced to a childlike state at the age of 23, forever silenced by Freeman's hand. He would boast of his speed of performing a lobotomy in under 10 minutes, of never wearing gloves, of using a hammer to drive the instrument through the thin bone above the eye. His final patient, Helen Mortensen, died in 1967 after a third lobotomy attempt, and that should have ended it, but the damage had already been done, not just to the bodies, but to the very idea of what psychiatric care could be. Before Freeman, we feared madness. After him, we feared the cure. And what of those we silenced in quieter ways? The isolation rooms, the padded cells, the restraints, all designed to manage rather than mend. At Friends Asylum in Philadelphia, nearly half the patients in 1915 spent time in solitary confinement, their stays ranging from hours to months. I remember the rooms bare, suffocating spaces with walls stuffed with horsehair to prevent self-harm, though the real injury was psychic. At Danvers, the basement-level isolation rooms were called the dungeons by staff, and I believed the name was earned. I once read a 1921 journal entry from a young nurse that described them as chambers where the light of day never penetrates, and the unfortunate occupants exist in perpetual twilight. We restrained patients with devices that today seem medieval: the Utica crib, a low wooden cage in which the patient was forced to lie motionless; the tranquilizer chair, which bound the body and head into perfect stillness; the MUF device, a leather hand-binding apparatus that drew admiration at the 1904 World's Fair. All of them designed allegedly for safety, but also unmistakably for silence. We were told we were doing good. We believed that structure, obedience, and discipline could restore order to the disordered mind. And perhaps in some cases we did help. But I carry with me the memories of those who were lost to our good intentions, those whose screams were mistaken for symptoms, whose silence was mistaken for success, whose deaths were written off as complications. I lived through that era. I saw what we did. And I wonder not just what we thought we were curing, but what we chose to forget. I remember how the silence of women echoed louder than screams within the walls of our asylums, how their diagnoses were handed down, not with understanding, but with judgment, how their behaviors, reading novels, speaking freely, refusing their husbands, were transmuted into symptoms, each one a sin against the roles society had assigned them, and how this quiet persecution filled our institutions with the voices of women who had simply dared to step outside the lines drawn for them. Between 1900 and 1950, I watched as women came through our doors in numbers that outpaced men nearly 3-to-1, a flood, justified by the medical consensus that the female mind was more fragile, more susceptible to nervous strain, and more dangerous when left ungoverned. I remember the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane in 1907 reporting that of its 432 patients were women, and over 40% of those were labeled with hysteria, a diagnosis that became the universal key to every locked door we had. The father of American psychiatry, Dr. Benjamin Rush, had written in his 1812 treatise that women's natural sensibility made them more prone to madness, and his words were gospel for nearly a century. We who were supposed to be caregivers became enforcers of silence and submission, our treatments tailored not to cure, but to correct. I read once about Elizabeth Parker, only 23, when her husband had her committed in 1908 for reading too many novels and refusing her marital duties. She died 8 years later in our care from tuberculosis, but I often wondered if what really killed her was the long, slow erasure of her selfhood. And she was not alone. There were files, hundreds of them, women committed for excessive novel reading, for political hysteria, for opinions too strong or affections too unorthodox. Mary Adelaide Henderson, I recall, had been sent to us in 1910 for reading penny dreadfuls and supporting women's suffrage. We called it madness. She called it freedom. Even Louisa May Alcott, though never institutionalized, understood what we were doing. In her story, Behind a Mask, she wrote of how society brands a woman mad the moment she tries to escape domestic monotony. I saw it in Alice Mitchell's eyes, a woman committed to Buffalo State Asylum in 1909 for what was described as masculine behavior and inappropriate mechanical interests. She had wanted to study engineering, that was all. But we stripped her of that dream with cold baths and restraint straps, treating her ambition as pathology. Her file, rediscovered years later, contained her desperate scrawl. I am not mad. I simply wish to study engineering. Is this truly a sign of insanity? She died of pneumonia 17 years after her commitment, still under our care. Her case was later cited in medical textbooks as a textbook example of sexual inversion, a phrase that allowed us to ignore her humanity and focus instead on classification. We institutionalized women for everything: grief, ambition, agitation. Neurasthenia, a condition popularized by Dr. George Beard in 1881, was used to explain everything from exhaustion to intellect. At the Massachusetts State Hospital, by 1910, 40% of our female patients carried that label. We had case files like that of Catherine Bartholomew, a suffragette admitted in 1912 for unnatural excitement about women's rights. Our superintendent, Dr. James Howard, recorded in his diary that a woman who steps beyond her natural sphere courts nervous collapse. We wrote it as science, but it was fear in disguise. I remember the stories Emma Dunbar confined for reading foreign literature and neglecting housework. Catherine Wells, who had marched in a suffrage parade and never went home again. Their diagnoses were thick with euphemism, moral insanity, political hysteria, spiritual disobedience. We didn't understand them, so we subdued them. Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell's Rest Cure, infamous for what it denied a woman's right to read, to write, even to think, was common in our halls. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who endured it in 1887, nearly lost herself to the silence it imposed. She later wrote, "The Yellow Wallpaper, a scream we refused to hear." Virginia Woolf suffered much the same. Treated by Dr. George Savage, who once prescribed marriage as a cure for her ambitions, she was subjected to treatments that sought to extinguish the fire of her thoughts. Her diaries revealed how the medical world tried to regulate her mind through diet confinement and the forced denial of her literary instincts. When she wrote, "These doctors speak of my brain as though it were a child's toy they could wind up or slow down at will," I felt the indictment meant for all of us. At Utica State Hospital in New York between 1900 and 1945, we took the war on womanhood even further. Dr. William Hammond believed that postpartum depression could be cured by ovarian compression, an agonizing procedure involving sustained pressure to the ovaries. I remember Eleanor Richards brought in after losing a child in childbirth, enduring 47 such sessions. Her cries echoed through the walls. We called them symptoms, but I remember. Even in institutions where women were supposed to find refuge, we segregated them into inferior wards, withheld therapies, and subjected them to more frequent restraints. At St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., 82% of electroshock treatments in 1940 were administered to women. Mary Jane Ward's The Snake Pit, drawn from her time at Rockland State Hospital, told the truth in ways we could no longer ignore. Ruth Morrison, a 19-year-old, was committed for excessive dancing and received 67 ECT treatments in 6 months. When I read that file, I closed it quickly. Elizabeth Packard's story still haunts me. In 1860, her husband had her committed simply for questioning his religious views. During her 3 years of confinement, she documented dozens of women who had been imprisoned by husbands seeking control. Her book, Modern Persecution, was one of the few early voices to name what we were doing. She fought back and won her freedom, even helped change laws in 4 states. But by 1927, 15 states still allowed men to commit their wives without medical examination. There were a few voices, like Dr. Margaret Cleaves, who tried to turn the tide. In her 1913 study, she documented cases where women's natural emotional responses were pathologized. She wrote of Sarah Thompson, whose grief after her child's death was treated as psychosis. Thompson's letters never delivered remain in our archives. I read them once, and one line stays with me. They say my tears are a symptom of madness, but how can a mother not weep for her child? Even overseas, it was no different. At Paris's Salpêtrière Hospital, Dr. Jean-Martin Charcot staged public displays of hysterical women, photographed and studied like specimens. Augustine, a patient admitted at 15 after suffering abuse, became the face of his theory. Her story, reclaimed by feminist historians decades later, revealed what the camera did not, how she was used, not healed. And so I remember them all not as cases or statistics, but as voices buried beneath white sheets and medical files, women who were punished for being too alive, too vocal, too much themselves. We told ourselves we were protecting them, curing them, saving them from themselves. But we were the storm, and they were the ones who endured it in silence behind barred windows and locked doors that bore their names. And even now, when I close my eyes, I can hear their voices, not mad, not broken, just unheard. I remember how even in the darkest corners of the asylum corridors, where dust floated in shafts of stale light, and the echoes of past screams never truly settled, there existed voices not of suffering, but of resistance, of reason, of something almost sacred, people who looked at the world of cages and padded cells and believed, despite all evidence, that change was possible, that cruelty was not the price of care, that the soul of psychiatry did not have to be a grim ledger of restraint, straps and locked doors, and that healing could perhaps emerge from something more radical than discipline, compassion. It was Dorothea Dix who first taught me what it meant to bear witness, not as a passive observer, but as a relentless advocate. I still see the look on her face when she walked through East Cambridge Jail in 1841 and found men and women with no crime but madness, chained in closets naked, bruised, beaten into compliance by those who had no understanding and less mercy. Her words, written in 1843 in her memorial to the Massachusetts legislature, became scripture for those of us who believed reform was possible. I proceed, gentlemen, briefly to call your attention to the present state of insane persons confined within this Commonwealth. That document, more than any medicine I ever administered, saved lives. It spoke not of pathology, but of pain, not of illness, but of injustice, and it moved mountains. 32 psychiatric hospitals were built or expanded because of her crusade, including the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum and the Illinois State Hospital, both places where I would later serve and see firsthand the legacy of a woman who never forgot the names of the people she fought for. She wasn't alone. In France, Philippe Pinel had decades earlier performed a gesture so simple and so symbolic that it felt biblical. He removed the chains from patients at Bicêtre Hospital in 1793, and in that moment redefined madness not as a crime, but as a condition worthy of dignity. His student, Jean-Étienne Esquirol, carried the work forward, founding 10 new hospitals across France, and demonstrating that when patients were treated like human beings, some of them astonishingly got better. These were the foundations I stood on when I entered the field. These were the saints of sanity. Across the Channel, in England. William Tuke, a Quaker and a merchant by trade, founded the York Retreat in 1796, where madness was met not with punishment, but with peace. There were no chains there, no shock treatments, no isolation, only gardens, silence, routine, and a belief that the soul could mend if given rest. His grandson Samuel Tuke documented these methods in 1813 in his description of the retreat, and those pages became the blueprint for a more humane world, a world that felt for a brief time possible. In America, another voice rose, Elizabeth Packard, a woman I came to revere not just for her bravery, but for her brilliance. In 1860, committed to an asylum by her husband for daring to question his religious views, she endured 3 years of confinement, during which she did not break, but rather transformed, recording, remembering, documenting the stories of 34 other women similarly imprisoned. Her book, Modern Persecution, laid bare the corruption of commitment laws, and her advocacy led to the Packard Law in Illinois in 1869, requiring jury trials before commitment. She fought the system from within its bowels and returned not broken, but blazing. Then came Clifford Beers, a man whose pain became prophecy. A patient himself, his 1908 memoir, A Mind That Found Itself, was unlike anything I had read. It was a confession and a condemnation, recounting nights in straitjackets, the indignity of forced silence, and the revelation that what we called treatment often resembled torture. His book sparked the formation of the National Committee for Mental Hygiene, and from that movement came a new idea that prevention mattered, that public health included the mind, that dignity and care were not mutually exclusive. Dr. Adolf Meyer was the first physician I met who treated patients not as puzzles, but as people. At the New York State Psychiatric Institute, he slashed the use of restraints by 80% and replaced them with occupational therapy, individual case histories, and genuine human interaction. He believed we must treat the whole person, not just the broken parts, and from his methods sprang a new generation of reformers who carried torches instead of scalpels. I recall Linda Richards, America's first trained nurse who founded the first psychiatric nursing program in 1882. Her students didn't learn how to subdue, they learned how to listen, how to speak with rather than about the patient, how to make eye contact without judgment. By 1915, she had trained over 500 nurses who spread these principles like seeds across every institution they entered. And Nellie Bly. God. Nellie Bly. Her name was whispered in every asylum for decades after her act of subterfuge in 1887 when she posed as a patient and gained admittance to Blackwell's Island Asylum. Her expose, 10 Days in a Madhouse, revealed beatings, ice baths, and starvation. When her story broke, a grand jury convened and New York allocated $850,000 to improve its institutions. I was there when that money began to flow, and I felt for the first time that journalism could be a scalpel too. We had heroes in science as well. Dr. Solomon Carter Fuller, the first African-American psychiatrist, stood at the vanguard of schizophrenia research, working with Emile Kraepelin and Alois Alzheimer, yet still insisting that what mattered most was kindness. He introduced occupational therapy not just as a diversion, but as a lifeline. His patients painted, gardened, wrote poetry, and some found in those small acts the first steps back to themselves. Mary Jarrett, a pioneering social worker, revolutionized how we saw the patient's life outside the institution. At Boston Psychopathic Hospital in 1913, she proved that if we understood the social causes, poverty, abuse, isolation, we could interrupt the descent into madness before the padded cell became the only option. Thanks to her work, social service departments became standard by 1920. Dr. Anna Besant Taylor introduced group therapy at St. Elizabeth's in 1904, and though some scoffed at the idea that the mentally ill could benefit from shared conversation, her results were undeniable. Structured group activities reduced restraint use, shortened hospital stays, and allowed people to rediscover not just themselves, but each other. Her techniques spread from Washington to San Francisco within a decade. It was these voices that sustained me through the darkest shifts, through the nights, when the storm outside matched the weeping within, through the mornings, when another name was added to the ledger of the lost. They reminded me that we were not merely custodians of suffering, we could be its undoing. And so I remember them, not because history has asked me to, but because my conscience demands it. I remember Dorothea and Clifford Nellie and Elizabeth Solomon and Linda Mary and Anna. I remember the nurses who whispered poems to patients in locked wards. I remember the attendants who unlocked windows instead of latches. I remember the doctors who refused to perform one more lobotomy even when the order came from above. We walked through fire to pull hope from ashes. We replaced chains with care dungeons, with dialogues, shock with shelter. And though the institutions still loom in memory like stone giants, I know now that within those walls, voices rose, defiant, determined, human, and because of them, the world tilted just a little more toward mercy. And now, as I sit in the quiet that once seemed so elusive, I find myself reflecting not only on the cruelty and the progress, not only on the mistakes and the reforms, but on the enduring truth that all institutions, no matter how grand, how brutal, or how well-intentioned, are built not just of stone and steel, but of people. And it is people who suffer, people who survive, people who dare to question, to remember, to heal. I walked those halls for years with keys in one hand and questions in the other. And though I cannot undo the pain I witnessed or the harm we sometimes caused in our ignorance, I can remember it honestly, speak it plainly, and carry it forward as a reminder, as a warning, and as a hope. Because the past is not dead, it waits for us to look back with clear eyes and open hands. And if we listen closely, we can still hear the whispers through the walls, some grieving, some grateful, all human, asking us not to forget.